Mark Rogers TV back with you as we're just 4 or 5 days away from college football on that Thursday night with Texas A&M and South Carolina as the headliner. We want to look at the entire season, do a huge season preview, and we bring in Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com. Hey, Joe, how are you?
I'm doing great, Mark. This is the stretch run last weekend before the actual season starts. I can't wait.
All right, next time we get together, we're going to talk about actual football being played on the field. But until then, we continue to speculate. So we're going to go conference by conference, want your take on the conference race, and pick a winner for us. So we'll start in the ACC, and I'm going weakest to strongest. This is my estimation. This is my thought here. I still think the ACC is the worst of the Power 5 conferences, despite having the national champion Florida State Seminoles. So I think the big news in this conference during the offseason is Louisville comes to town, and they're in the Atlantic Division along with Florida State and Clemson, the stronger of the two divisions. The other one fairly balanced with, wow, take your pick amongst North Carolina, Georgia Tech, Virginia Tech, Duke, and some others there. So your thoughts about how this shapes out with Florida State, Clemson, Louisville, and then the other division as well?
I think it'll be a very competitive conference overall, but in my opinion, I think Florida State is the team to beat in the whole ACC conference. Louisville comes in, a very explosive offense with Bobby Petrino, but I think it is Florida State's conference. I think they win the conference championship and dominate just like they did last year. I think Virginia Tech could be the other team that they play in the conference championship, but I still think head and shoulders Florida State the team to beat in the ACC.
Yeah, so you bring up Virginia Tech. They're a team that once somewhat dominated this conference through most of the 2000s. They've slid back to a 7 or 8 win football team the past couple of years. I think 15 and 11 the last 2 years. Florida State, the cream of the crop by far. Then there seems to be a drop-off to Clemson, and then Clemson seems to be on its own rung as well over the past couple of years. And then you've got a plethora of teams, again, Virginia Tech, North Carolina. So you like Virginia Tech to emerge amongst that kind of blanket division there with every other one there with the new quarterback.
I do. I think that Logan Thomas, in a way, sort of handcuffed this team. His inability and inconsistency in the passing game really hurt the Hokies, especially in their tougher ball games. I think it's a different type of team now, a younger team, more experience on the defensive end, and I think Bud Foster has a very good game plan coming in, and the swing game for Virginia Tech this season, even though it isn't a conference game, is that second week of the season in the Horseshoe against Ohio State. A little bit different now without Braxton Miller. If they can knock off the Buckeyes on the road, could change their season in a big way.
It's not really a difficult schedule for Virginia Tech. If you look at it, no Florida State, no Clemson on that the slate in the ACC, and of course, if you're talking about national perspective, yeah, that game in Columbus could really set them up if they could pull off the upset there. Do you see Florida State possibly losing a game? I don't think they're going to lose a game, but if they do, who would that be?
Well, I think two teams in particular really jump out for me. It's Clemson and it's Louisville because of the tempo perspective and the offenses that they like to run. When I look at that national championship game last year against Auburn, in my opinion, the Florida State defense struggled from a tempo perspective. So I think if Clemson and Louisville could start fast against the Florida State Seminoles defense, they could have an opportunity to pull off the upset. Another team that has the ability, because it is a rivalry game, is the Miami Hurricanes. That's always a tough game. Jake Heaps takes over as the starting quarterback. So if Miami and Duke Johnson get some early success, that's another game that could give Florida State some problems.
All right, so we got Clemson going to Florida State a little bit later. We know that was a debacle at Clemson this past season. It was supposed to be a great game. Florida State, the prohibitive favorite in the ACC. So you're going Florida State over Virginia Tech in the championship game, right?
That's what I have right now. Yeah, Florida State and Virginia Tech in the ACC championship game. Florida State, though, does win it. I don't think they'll go undefeated, though, for the year, and I don't think they win the national championship.
Do they get into the college football playoff?
I think there is a possibility that they're there. I have them ranked number 2. I could see them losing one game, possibly 2, but I think they are there in the playoff at the end.
All right, Joe, bear with me a little bit. I'm going to try to throw in my picks, even though they're totally on the fly. These are not the official picks. I do like Florida State over North Carolina. I'll go that as my ACC championship game. Like the Tar Heels with Marquise Williams coming back and a lot of talent on the defensive side of the football, despite losing a couple guys to the NFL. Let's move on to the Big 12, where for much of the season, in my eyes, Oklahoma was a decent football team, but more in that top 15 to top 20 range. Then they win at Bedlam. They steal a game there. Then, of course, everybody has the thought and the picture of what happened at the Sugar Bowl, and that has ridden through the postseason and the offseason, I should say, for the Oklahoma Sooners. Baylor really handled them in Waco last season. Bryce Petty back at quarterback. Then you've got maybe that next tier with Oklahoma State leading the way along with Kansas State. So size up the Big 12 for us.
Well, I think Oklahoma was the team to beat in the conference, but now with Frank Shannon gone, Dorial Green-Beckham not allowed to play, with the NCAA appeal being denied, a lot more pressure on that Oklahoma team as a whole. I sort of like Baylor now. I think Baylor has the ability to really run away with the conference. When you look at their ability and what they were able to do against Texas and Oklahoma now, I sort of like Baylor as the front runner. Blake Bell now, from what I hear, is taking some pre-game snaps at the quarterback position in case Trevor Knight fails. So I think a little more pressure now falling on that Oklahoma team as a whole. Before a couple of years ago, he looked like the front runner in the conference.
Yeah, Trevor Knight, for as well as he played in the Sugar Bowl, and he was really confident delivering the football, he was that shaky the rest of the season. And Oklahoma, yeah, some offseason issues. Joe Mixon doesn't look like he necessarily will be on the field as well, but I love the outside pass rush that Oklahoma brings with Capper and Stryker. I think that they're rock solid on defense. I think that they're strong in every unit on the offensive side. And Trevor Knight, he's a wild card, but I'm going to have faith in him. The game against Baylor's in Norman this year, so I like Oklahoma to pull out the Big 12 Conference, but not necessarily go undefeated. I'm looking at possibly a 10-2 year out of Oklahoma. What I like out of the Big 12 Conference, and this was kind of by default, they didn't want it this way, no championship game, which I love the conference championship games, but they play everyone. So it's a legitimate championship. You don't have to think about who's not playing who when you look size up the Big 12. Any sleepers there amongst Oklahoma State, Kansas State, anybody else there?
Well, I like Oklahoma State, and the reason is Mike Gundy, a very underrated coach, 10-3 last year. J.W. Walsh, a very solid quarterback. I like the offensive system. I know they lose some defensive talent in Gilbert, but I like what Oklahoma State brings from a tempo perspective on offense and just from a coaching perspective. Mike Gundy does a great job in Stillwater in making his teams competitive, always a great game plan, and I think Oklahoma State not only can give Florida State some problems week one, but they could be a possible sleeper in the Big 12 to win it outright.
Yeah, I'm going to say Oklahoma wins this thing at 10-2. Baylor goes 10-2 as well, but Sooners win the head-to-head matchup. Then I like Kansas State and Oklahoma State. I've done scheduled previews on everyone, so I've kind of looked up and sized up the records, and I like both those teams at about 8-4. Of course, Oklahoma State dives right into the deep end in week one with Florida State at Cowboys Stadium. Let's move on, Joe, to the Big Ten Conference, where the major offseason story was just a few days ago. Braxton Miller out for the season. J.T. Barrett, the redshirt freshman, in at Ohio State. Most people had eyed that November 8th matchup in East Lansing, Spartans and Buckeyes, as the de facto Big Ten championship game. How much do you think Braxton Miller's situation has changed the race?
I think it changes it tremendously. When I look at the Big Ten Conference as a whole, I still like Michigan State with Braxton Miller at the helm for Ohio State. They really impressed me what they were able to do last year in not only the Big Ten championship game, but in the Rose Bowl against Stanford. A very dominant victory on both the offense and defensive lines, and I think that's something that goes unnoticed when you look at this Michigan State team. Now that Braxton Miller is out of the mix, a couple other teams within the conference can really step up. One of those teams to me is Nebraska. Can they make a move within the conference? Very difficult. And then Wisconsin's another team now. Tanner McAvoy will get the start, Mark, against LSU. They're a possible team that can make some noise as well. But I think Braxton Miller, I had Greg Fry on my show, the former Ohio State quarterback. He thinks it's a big 2 to 3 game swing without a solid quarterback. That's not to take away from J.T. Barrett, but let's be honest. He's a redshirt freshman, going to be making his first career start in Baltimore. A lot of pressure on that Buckeye team now.
Oh, Greg Fry. Didn't have a cannon for a right arm, but knew what he was doing, no doubt about that. And if you want to see a great comeback on YouTube, look up Ohio State, Minnesota, 1989. Buckeyes down 31-0, come back and win. I remember it well. All right, back to 2014, and I'm really wavering on the Big Ten. This is a pick that I'm going to have to make up until the 12th hour, up until midnight. I'm going to have to wait on this one because, man, I think Michigan State's a better team than Ohio State. I think the Buckeyes have a better and more talented roster. So
Right.
I think that even though people dismissed Ohio State as soon as Braxton Miller was hurt, I think
Right.
J.T. Barrett has 8 weeks to prepare for that Michigan State game. I think they win every other game. At Happy Valley could be a little tricky for the Buckeyes. Obviously, Virginia Tech's going to be a challenge, but that's outside the Big Ten. Doesn't come into play in terms of the conference race. Michigan's still going to have something to say, I think. I know nobody's talking about Michigan or Penn State. Hackenberg's going to be fun to watch this year, and James Franklin's still building toward what we're going to see out of Penn State in future years. But don't be surprised. I think everybody's just, bam, November 8th, Ohio State, Michigan State. I think there could be a little rumbling in there and some upsets, and the Big Ten left out of the college football playoff because a conference champion might be 10-2 or 11-2 after winning the conference championship. On the other side, Wisconsin seems to be the heavy favorite, but only 9 starters back. Again, the last time we got together, Joe, we talked about the inability or the concern that Wisconsin has in moving the football against elite defenses with the lack of an outside receiving threat with Abradaris gone and no real proven guy there. They insert Tanner McAvoy to try to make plays, but against, again, they're going to be helped out by their schedule. No Ohio State, no Michigan, no Penn State or Michigan State, Ohio State, Michigan State, or Michigan or Penn State, any of the Big Four from the Eastern Division for Wisconsin. I do think Iowa's a sleeper. I know they lose that elite linebacking core with Kirksey and company, but I like Iowa with a veteran quarterback. And something that's not been talked about much in the Big Ten is that, and this has kind of been compromised by the Braxton Miller situation, but unlike other conferences in college football, all the contenders have starting quarterbacks back except Taylor Martinez at Nebraska. So the Huskers might have something to say about it. Kenny Bell at wideout. Amir Abdullah might be the best in the nation. Certainly he and Melvin Gordon the best in the Big Ten. So I'm going to say right now it's a Michigan. I'm going to go off the board here with Ohio State and Iowa playing in the Big Ten championship game.
I agree. Well, you're going Ohio State and Iowa. I would go Michigan State and Iowa, and the reason for that is I like Jake Rudock at the quarterback position. I like what Iowa was able to do. If you watch that January 1st game against a very physical LSU Tiger defense and offense, like what Iowa has in the tank heading into the season. When you look at some of the other teams that you mentioned, Tanner McAvoy, not a lot of tape on Tanner McAvoy, so that's a positive. Same thing with J.T. Barrett. When you look at these week 1 matchups, Mark, when these teams prepare for these new quarterbacks, it's not like they have game film to go to and they can actually prepare. It's sort of like preparing on the fly. So that's a positive for both Wisconsin and Ohio State in their week 1 matchups, and then the teams will have to get used to their strengths and weaknesses as the season progresses. But if you're asking me who's going to be there in the end, I still think it's Michigan State. Connor Cook, a very solid quarterback, great head coach, and Mark D'Antonio. I like Lankford at the running back position, and I just like the strength of the offense and defensive lines by Michigan State. I think it would be Michigan State and Iowa in the conference championship.
Yeah, if you look at the Buckeye situation, it all rode on Braxton Miller because losing 4 out of 5 offensive linemen, some of those to the NFL. Carlos Hyde was a beast. The running backs are not proven with Elliott and Briante Dunn and Rod Smith. And then on the outside, Philly Brown was not a spectacular guy, but caught 60, 65 balls. They don't have him. Devin Smith has been up and down. I've heard Urban Meyer comment that this guy could be a superstar, and it looks like it on certain weeks. Then he disappears for like 3 weeks at a time. And then we know the issues on defense, and they got the tremendous front, but the back seven's a question mark. If you look at the recruiting rankings, It shouldn't be a question mark, but it got so bad that Urban Meyer said we scrapped the entire secondary scheme that we used last year and completely started from scratch. That's how bad it was for the Buckeyes in the back seven last year. All right, good stuff with Michigan State and Iowa going to the Big Ten championship game in Indianapolis. All right, let's move it out to the Pac-12, Joe. And UCLA seems to be everybody's darlings after a strong finish last year. And you see Jim Mora moving up the ante year in, year out. It's going up in the right direction, the ascension for UCLA. They will battle it out most likely with USC and Arizona State in the South. And it seems to be the same old story in the North with Stanford coming back against Oregon. So size it up for us.
I still like UCLA as the team to beat this year because of Brett Hundley at the quarterback position. I agree with you. Stanford and Oregon will be there in the other conference just because of the physicality on defense that Stanford likes to play. But when you look at their offensive line, 2 sophomores starting on the right side, that should put a lot of pressure on that offense. And Kevin Hogan, and then the defense loses some players, but I still like Stanford and Oregon in the other division. But I think UCLA overall is the best team in the conference because of Brett Hundley, because of what he brings to the table. And then you mentioned what Jim Moore is building there. You look at a very physical style of defense that they have in UCLA. I think they really are the team to beat, and I think that Oregon does get challenged week number 2 against Michigan State, so just keep that in mind as well. But I think UCLA is the cream of the crop in the Pac-12.
A couple things to keep in mind. Stanford's got an extremely difficult schedule. They don't miss any of the tough teams in the Pac-12. So in the Pac-12, you got 12 teams, so you got 11 other teams, and you got 9 games, so you missed 2. And Stanford's schedule is loaded. They do have Oregon. That game, they've got to go to Eugene. They played them at Palo Alto last year when they pulled off the upset. And so that's key there. The quirk that I don't like in the Pac-12 schedule that I came across, and we saw it 2 years ago, where if it's UCLA Stanford, they would play back-to-back weeks. So
Right.
Whatever happened to Stanford and Cal playing the final game of the season, I don't know. But now it's Stanford UCLA playing at the Rose Bowl, and then they might have to play at 49ers Stadium the next week in the Pac-12 championship game if that's the way it turns out. I like Oregon in the North, and I like UCLA in the South and the Bruins to win the Pac-12 championship.
I could see that. I mean, that 2 solid picks when you said that. I'm a tradition guy. I like to see those old tradition and rivalries stay intact. I don't like the new format. I don't know if you do, but I'm more of the old school type of mentality. Keep those rivalries in place. Keep those last game of the season. Those are the games that fans and college football fans as a whole want to see. But when you mention UCLA and Oregon, I would have to probably agree with you as well in terms of the Pac-12 championship, just because of the inexperience on the offensive line for Stanford and a very, very difficult schedule. But Kevin Hogan and Ty Montgomery on the outside, anything's possible. And David Shaw, a very underrated coach. It wouldn't shock me if Stanford's there in the end as well.
Exactly. So the Pac-12, we will see what the Pac-12 shows us this year. Many are seeing this as a deeper conference than the SEC and possibly vying for the status as best conference in the country. I don't think they're quite there, and that's why I save what I consider the best for last is the SEC. So let's look at the West. Auburn emerges last year after 0-8 in the conference in 2012. LSU looking for stability at quarterback. It looks like it's going to be Anthony Jennings. Alabama with a quarterback battle, and it looks like it's Jacob Coker. They seem to be the 3 gunning in the West. Then you got some wild cards in Ole Miss and Mississippi State, and we've knocked around the Rebels and the Dogs in previous video posts. Then out east, Georgia with Hudson Mason at quarterback and a ton coming back on defense. I really love the Dogs' defense, and especially with Jeremy Pruitt in place giving the instruction there. South Carolina loses a ton on the defensive front. They have issues in the secondary. They lose their quarterback, but Dylan Thompson has a big game experience. And Florida's a huge wild card in this, and you would think Tennessee, Vandy are still a year or 2 away. So the SEC.
Well, you know how I feel about the SEC East. I'm all in favor of the Georgia Bulldogs because of the offensive talent that they have surrounding Hudson Mason. 5th-year senior, got a lot of experience when Aaron Murray went down. Todd Gurley, Keith Marshall, Nick Chubb, Sonny Michael, Brendan Douglas, those wideouts led by Chris Connolly, Michael Bennett, they're loaded, and even Malcolm Mitchell, who's injured, but he's in the mix as well on the Georgia side. When you look at the defense, yes, Jeremy Pruitt, I think, will aid that defense. And in my opinion, after the first 2 games of the season, which I think Georgia will win, Clemson and South Carolina, not a team on their schedule that really will challenge the Georgia defense. And in terms of their weakness, which we know is their secondary, very raw and young until the Auburn game. So I like Georgia in the East. In the West, it's a toss-up, but I still like the Auburn Tigers. I know Georgia and Auburn meet later in the year, but I like Nick Marshall. I like Gus Malzahn, and I'm still not sold on Alabama with Jacob Coker and Lane Kiffin, a new offensive coordinator and a new quarterback starting the year for Alabama. I don't think they'll have a mediocre season, but I could see possibly 3 losses on the Alabama schedule that'll keep them out of the SEC championship game. You mentioned Florida. Florida with Kurt Roper is going to aid that offense. He comes over from Duke, the former offensive coordinator there, but they had a very blue-collar type of mentality from an offensive line perspective with former offensive coordinator Brent Peace, more of a ground-and-pound attack. I think it's going to take a little bit of time in terms of growing pains to get used to the new system, and I think Florida will struggle this year. I see more of a 6-6 mark out of that team. And Ole Miss and Miss State are 2 sleepers that if they could put it together consistency-wise, they could be possible dark horses, but I still like Georgia and Auburn in the SEC championship.
So, Joe, I know you didn't pick Alabama to lose 3 games and go 9-3, but you said possibly 3 losses, and I'm trying to find those 3 losses. Of course, they got Auburn, but Alabama, and this is what drives me crazy about SEC scheduling and Big Ten and ACC, so I'm not going to leave them out, is that Alabama's got they've got Tennessee and Florida, which, again, the Gators should be improved, but still not quite to the ilk of Alabama. And then Auburn's got to deal with South Carolina and Georgia on the other side. That's a huge disadvantage, I think, for Auburn. They could end up winning the Iron Bowl, and because of that situation, get left out of the championship game. I just don't see 3 losses on Alabama's schedule. I think they play a garbage non-conference slate with West Virginia the best one. That drives me crazy that Alabama, with all the stock we're putting on this college football playoff and comparing conferences, can't play anybody better than West Virginia. So anyway, Auburn's got they've got a game against Kansas State. Everybody else has somebody, LSU, Wisconsin, but Alabama's not playing anyone that I think can challenge them. I know that you like West Virginia to maybe put a little scare into them, but I like Alabama coming out of the West. I don't necessarily think that they're decidedly the best team, especially with the issues at quarterback, but Auburn's had a difficult offseason. They had the magic of last year. I don't know if they can recapture some of the bounces that went their way. And in the East, I just think in recent years we've seen Georgia with exceptional individuals on defense, but it's like a head-scratcher. Like, why isn't this defense? They're good, but they're not anywhere close to dominant. They should be better, and I think Jeremy Pruitt has a chance to put all the pieces together and make it work. And I think Georgia plays Alabama in the championship game in the SEC, and man, I can't go against Nick Saban in an SEC title game.
Well, that's great points that you brought up. And when you mentioned the 3 losses by Alabama or potential losses that I see, I mean, I'm looking at the Iron Bowl with Auburn, a very tough matchup. I saw what Nick Marshall and that offense was able to do against a very solid Alabama Crimson Tide defense. And then I'm also looking at the LSU game. By the time Alabama and LSU meet, a lot of offensive talent that's raw for Les Miles and that team in Baton Rouge, but by the time they play Alabama, Leonard Fournette, Malachi Dupree, and those quarterbacks will have a lot of game experience, and then John Chavis and that defense always poses problems for an Alabama offense. So that's 2 games right there. You talk about a game with Ole Miss that's potentially a very difficult game for Alabama's physical defensive line. Could be 3 losses. That's what I'm looking at. And then when you look at that opening week matchup against West Virginia, I think there'll be some growing pains. I am expecting Alabama to struggle out of the gate. I don't think it'll be like these week 1 matchups that we're used to watching at the start of the college football season when they play Clemson and Michigan and Virginia Tech, and it's just a blowout in the making. I think this is sort of shaping up to be a more difficult game than people think against Big 12 opponent West Virginia.
And we have to keep in mind the 2 most experienced quarterbacks in the SECs coming back are at Ole Miss and Mississippi State with Dak Prescott and with Bo Wallace. So that's the SEC with again, Georgia-Auburn championship game, huh?
That's what I'm calling. I'm sticking to my guns. I like Georgia at the beginning of the year, prior to all the injuries, prior to all the suspensions that we've seen in college football, and I still like what Nick Marshall and Gus Malzahn have done on the Plains in Auburn. When you look at that team, they did get a lot of breaks. I'm not taking away from the 2 games against Georgia and Alabama, but from a tempo perspective, really created a lot of problems, even for a top-notch defense in Florida State. I think another year in the system, Nick Marshall, I like the Auburn Tigers. I know they have a very difficult schedule, but I still like Auburn in the end.
All right, Joe, the best of the rest. We got BYU, we got Notre Dame, we got Fresno State, Boise State, Central Florida, Houston. A lot of people like the Cougars. Anybody out there that may make us have to kind of think about what 4 teams should be in it?
Well, I think it's BYU, and when you look at this team, I like Taysom Hill at the quarterback position, and BYU are very physical offense and defensive lines. Bronco Mendenhall always does a solid job out in Provo, and I like that team. Jamal Williams won't start the opener, but he'll be back for game number 2. They have a very easy schedule, in my opinion. They're used to playing Notre Dame. They're used to playing a lot of solid teams, and this year they take a step back in terms of competitive overall out-of-conference play. I think when you look at the schedule for BYU as a whole, it matches up that they can be there in the end. And Taysom Hill, one of the most underrated quarterbacks in college football, can't just beat you with his arm. He's a legitimate runner, sets records for BYU. That's a team that you have to really keep your eye out on.
All right, Joe, I've seen a number of Final Four predictions, the college football playoffs, from a zillion different people. And especially before Braxton Miller got hurt, it seemed to be the same 5 or 6 teams. Everybody looking at Oklahoma, Alabama, Ohio State, but not so much now, maybe Michigan State, UCLA, Oregon, Florida State. That seemed to be the mix, and just mix them up, and those are the only 5 or 6 teams that make it. But look at history. If you take the BCS era, and you could go back before that, but the BCS era, and you looked at the preseason poll versus where the teams finished, or if you looked at the Final Four before the bowl games and implemented the format, the college football playoff, to the BCS to say, okay, what 4 teams would have made it? Every year there was a team 15, 16, 20 in the country, and in the case of Michigan State and Auburn, not ranked in the preseason poll. Right. So most likely the odds say that even though it's difficult to imagine that somebody unranked or somebody 20th or 22nd in the country right now is going to make that playoff.
I agree with that. I think you're absolutely right. We can only predict before the season starts, but that's what makes college football so special, is when the season takes place, it becomes a crazy, crazy atmosphere and a crazy stretched run when you look at it, because the way the schedule lines up for some of these teams could really sort of bolster their run at a title. And when you look at a team like Ohio State that really had their eye on the prize, how does a team like that fare before the season even starts, losing their Heisman Trophy candidate in Braxton Miller? So a lot of things have changed prior to the season starting, and I think that just makes it that much more of going to be a crazy college football season. We don't know what to expect. We can only speculate, but I think this is going to be a wild college football season. You're absolutely right. There's going to be a team that we're not talking about now that will be there in the end.
So if there's a team that's not currently in the preseason top 25 that's going to make it, and while you were talking, I was trying to go all over the country in my head to figure out what team would I consider a true sleeper. Not some of these people are throwing out sleepers like Georgia's a sleeper. They're not a sleeper. I mean a true sleeper like Auburn going from 3-9 to the BCS championship game, or Missouri going to the SEC title game. And for me, I think it's Iowa.
Right.
They're my big sleeper pick.
Really?
Not that they're going to do it, but if anybody does it outside the top 25, they're going to be a favorite in their first 10 games. Then they finish with Nebraska and Wisconsin, and I believe both of those games are at home.
Well, let me tell you, that's a great pick. Kirk Ferentz does a great job in preparing his team. They have a solid quarterback in Rudock. Really, when you look at that game last year on the road in Columbus, almost pulled that game out with a very young team. So you're not really off the mark, and not a lot of credit given to the Iowa Hawkeyes to start the season. You might be right on. I mean, a solid offense and defensive line. When you look at the way they're built, Iowa, they're not as flashy as some of the other teams in the conference, but what they do have is a very physical offense and defensive lines, a la Michigan State. Maybe, in my opinion, not on the same level, but they do have a great foundation that they built, and as long as you have that, you can make a title run.
And then it becomes a one-game season, and they'd be a substantial underdog to most likely Michigan State or Ohio State. But hey, we've seen it happen before in a conference championship game. All right, Joe, good stuff. Anything else you'd like to toss in here?
Well, I think the week one matchups are really interesting, Mark. I mean, when you look at it now, I'm really looking forward to this Ohio State-Navy game. A lot of pressure put on the Buckeyes and JT Barrett. Really want to see how that team responds, losing their emotional leader and their team leader in Braxton Miller. Are they just going to come out flat, or are they going to come out emotional, looking to really make a statement in that ball game? And I'm curious to see how Ohio State responds in Baltimore. But I think overall it's going to be a great weekend of college football. Let's kick it off already. I can't wait.
Yeah, that'll be a game where we'll see what kind of leadership they have in the clubhouse, because, again, if they hit a little adversity and it's a 3-0 game after the first quarter, then they might start to cave in and panic and think, what's going on and what kind of season are we going to have? Or if they've got the leaders, then they pull together because they got by far the superior talent and run away with that game and really put their foot on the gas in that one. So, Joe, goforthe2.com. You can find him there, and you can find him on Twitter. Again, it's Joe Lisi, Go for the Two. And, Joe, we always appreciate the passion and the insight, man.
Mark, you have a great show. I love being a guest anytime you want me. I love talking about college football.